Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here. Today we're going to be looking at women's suffrage, the very famous and very important 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But not only really that amendment specifically, we're going to be taking a background look at how women fought for the right to vote. That is what suffrage means, if you're not familiar with that word. So let's take a look at it. So our essential questions, and what we're really looking at here in this lesson, is we're going to try to contextualize the women's rights movement. And so you can see here our objective: trace the women's rights movement from 1848 to 1920, and analyze claims for female voting rights in various 1920s contexts. So we're going to try to understand this from really a not just a historical perspective, but also how did people see it through their own eyes when they were fighting for women's right to vote. So, how do rights movements extend far back in history? We're going to go all the way back here to 1848. And then how does context affect how larger ideas are branded or argued? And you're going to see that where you are and who you are and what your background in particular is going to affect how people argue for the right, that women should have the right, to be able to vote. So let's talk about Seneca Falls. Okay. So Seneca Falls is located here at this blue dot here in New York, and it is all the way back in 1848. Now I know that we discussed this very briefly with the Second Great Awakening, okay, but eventually this is what most historians will point to as really the start of the women's rights movement. It is the first rights convention in the United States, again in Seneca, New York. Now it takes place in what's called Seneca Falls over 2 days. Okay. There's a bunch of very, very famous figures there. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, I think William Lloyd Garrison as well was there, but I'll need to double check that. And what really comes out of it is the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which you can go look at, and it very heavily riffs off of the Declaration of Independence. And basically what it's calling for there is things that women are eventually going to advocate that they should have later. More influence in the public sphere, and generally things of that jazz. So let's talk about the 1920s, because that's really the time period that we're talking about, not only in this unit, but then also that's really the moment when women gain power from several sources. Okay, so let's talk about how do we get this 1920s movement. Number one, individuals. This lady over here, just above me, that is Carrie Chapman Catt. Women just like her, and again, we shouldn't point to Catt for everything, but really it was individuals who kind of helped galvanize the movement to get going. The second thing is volunteer associations or volunteer organizations, and we've actually looked at these before. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a way for women to get involved in the public sphere. Also, a lot of the work that I'm doing currently on my thesis is that showing that women also started to interact, not just in volunteer organizations like this, but then also in literally in some cases claiming pensions from the Civil War, which is kind of an aside, but something interesting. Anyway, so we've talked about these volunteer associations. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, okay, not NASA, NASA, and the last one, it was the one I just mentioned here before, so the abolition and temperance movements. And from this, women get quite a bit of instruction on how they should be organized, what kind of tactics work, how to build kind of community groups and to get them to actually get the needle moving on things like women's suffrage. So what tactic strategies would you use to get the vote, assuming that you had never had the vote before? So we're going to assume here that you're not living out in one of the western states that gave women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment. But what do you think that you would do? And for ideas, consider modern day protests or what labor unions did in the past. I'll give you some time to think about it. So in history, what women did for suffrage is very similar, actually, to many modern-day demonstrations that we know of. And it's everything from hunger drives to petitions to marches. In some cases, you can see there the lady on the bottom right. There's some indications of even, I wouldn't necessarily say violence, but certainly more active kinds of protests. So women chaining themselves to fences and those kind of things. And in fact, what that lady to the right there, I believe, is doing is actually picketing outside the White House. And I actually want to show you an example of this here in just a second, because there's some really interesting posters on that. So let's talk about the arguments for why women believed that they should have the right to vote. Okay, so it does depend on the context of which people were operating in. So for those families who had sons shipped off to fight in World War I, again, coercive volunteerism, right, is that many families begin to argue, well, my son fought, so, like, why should I also not be able to vote? If we're sending our sons over there to go and die, we should have the right to vote. In cities, because again, we're kind of in like some late Victorian kind of time period here, there's this idea that women can restore basically the cleanliness and morality of the dirty world of politics. And it's kind of this old idea of Republican motherhood that we've talked about before, that women are this like sacred home that is like the pure part of the world. And so there was that thought, especially in cities. Also in cities, it was thought that women would help lessen the power of immigrants. And so for, let's say, for example, if somebody at that time really detested the growing power that immigrants had in a community, giving women the vote could help basically clamp down on those immigrants' relative power in that area. For progressives, they saw this as a way to expand democracy. Kind of makes sense. During the Great Migration, during the Great Migration, it's also thinking about giving the vote to women is also a way that some people argue that it will lessen the power of blacks moving up into the north. And with, as you've seen now, hopefully in the earlier activities, either from this lesson or if you know of the Great Migrations before, the massive numbers of black Americans who are moving north looking for jobs in that, post kind of during World War I environment, is basically throwing lots of people in the north into a very uncomfortable position. And so for them, giving women the vote is going to, kind of similar to immigrants, it's going to give less power to blacks overall. Okay, and for Southerners, especially Southern women, this is kind of riffing off the same theme here. This is a way to preserve white supremacy in the South. If all of a sudden you can double the size of your electorate in a white voting bloc, that's going to give you a lot of power that you probably haven't had before. And so the arguments here that women use, and not just women, but also people who advocate for women's suffrage use, really does depend on the context in which somebody lives. Okay, so you can see here a whole bunch of protest signs, and again, you're going to notice that lots of these things are based on kind of things that is touched upon. So if you can, I'd highly recommend you, like when you look at the slides, to pause and kind of check at these. There's lots of very, very interesting signs that are used. This one down here in the bottom is really interesting. Kaiser Wilson, so making him look like German. Making him look like Germans and look like Germany in World War I. Have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. You might remember like Woodrow Wilson's big push for self-determination. It says, take the beam out of your own eye, which is, if you've ever heard of the cliche or the saying that, take the stick out of your eye, instead of like looking at the logs in someone else's or something. There's a cliche based on that. But some very anti-Wilson things here. And speaking of Wilson, Wilson was very, very resistant to the idea of giving women the vote. And finally, after several years, Woodrow Wilson is convinced by women and from pressure by women that should be done. Now, again, this is after right around the time Wilson is also having a stroke. So just be aware, like Wilson's influence in terms of what's going on in Washington is also changing pretty dramatically. Okay. Now the last thing, is once Woodrow Wilson's kind of convinced, how the amendment process works is that it is sent out to states. Now, there's actually two ways that amendments can be passed and ratified into the Constitution, but we've only ever used one of them. And so in this system, Congress goes and writes the 19th Amendment. It's sent out to states, and they have to hit 2/3 of the states in order for it to be adopted into the Constitution. Tennessee is the 36th state to do so, and it's only passed because of a single vote by a state legislator in Tennessee, because there was just a divided representation in Tennessee about this, and he was convinced, he was told by his mother that he had to vote for the 19th Amendment, which is rather interesting. Kind of an interesting thing that, his mom, and it's being the 19th Amendment. Okay, cool. So go ahead. This is the end of this lesson. So hopefully this is kind of showing you not only how the 19th Amendment was passed, but then also how the people's context shaped the way in which they argued for the 19th Amendment. And other than that, I will see you later. Bye-bye.